pull myself out. Okay. Brandon, if I'm just going to give you, if I give you a word and then you can give it a beat or two so I can cut around it. And then, but I'm just going to prompt you with some stuff and give me your impressions. So, uh, tell me about Jesus.
For me, Jesus is a radical socio-political and socio-spiritual revolutionary. I think so often in our modern world, Christianity has created a Jesus that's more of an institutionalized religious guru rather than the first century renegade rabbi that he was. Jesus's message was about creating a kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. But that kingdom doesn't come through power, it doesn't come through privilege, it doesn't come through political mechanisms necessarily. Jesus's kingdom was about working with the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed, bringing them into community, and through one subversive act of love at a time, creating a more just and equal world. And Jesus's vision of toppling the empire in his day, again, wasn't with force, wasn't with power. It was through community organizing. It was through getting people together at the most basic level around dinner tables and beginning with imagining what a new world could look like and then going out into their communities and doing it, and not relying on institutions, not relying on governments, but building a new world from the ground up.
Great. Thank you. Can you give us a sense, and not easy, but give me a sense of what Jesus has become in the American imagination and maybe a little bit about why?
Yeah, I think the Jesus that exists today for most American Christians is a Jesus that doesn't exist. Um, I think there's a long institutionalized story in Christianity of taking the radical renegade rabbi from Nazareth and turning him into a religious figure to be worshipped instead of to be followed. And I do think that today Jesus has a big fan club, but very few people that are actually willing to follow him. The American Jesus is one that defends nationalism. The American Jesus is the one that exists to empower institutions while causing fear and submission among lay people. The American Jesus is divorced from the radical socio spiritual message that Jesus of Nazareth embodied in his day 2,000 years ago. And I think the American Jesus looks a lot more like white cisgender heterosexual men in America rather than the person from the margins, rather than the oppressed person from the Roman Empire who was out in his world trying to resist the forces of power that were at work in his day and causing so many people so much oppression. And so the American Jesus is one that has been made in the image of the dominant people in America. And the religion that has formed around the American Jesus, again, is more about rituals and right doctrines than it is about the socio spiritual political message that I really believe the first century Jesus of Nazareth actually embodied, actually preached. Um, yeah. Also, I feel like I'm repeating myself, so forgive me.
Not at all. No, this is great. Well, you mentioned it's just gender issues, or not just gender, sexuality. Talk about how that's landing in America right now and why. Maybe your thoughts on that. Big question, I know, but give me your thoughts on maybe the fear that's generated around this and maybe what we can do, what can be done in the face of that, perhaps.
Yeah. I think the truth is that in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there was this unholy union of the Republican Party and the white evangelical establishment. I think both were seeing a decline, and we have this on historical records. There are documentations of the meetings that happened between folks like Jerry Falwell and James Dobson with Republican leadership. And when they got together, I mean, rather smartly, they identified two issues that would cause a reaction from their base. And the issues they chose were abortion and homosexuality. Now, what's remarkable is that from a biblical perspective, there is a lot in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament in particular, about sex and gender. And the reason for that was in the ancient world, the ancient Jewish people had a primary concern, and that was survival. And so there's a lot in the Hebrew Bible about proper sexual relations and defending, uh, putting women down on a lower status and giving men more power, because in their minds, if they could focus on repopulation, making sure they grew the amount of people that were in their community, they could survive. The religious right has taken this ancient concern and turned it into a modern political concern. And they use very similar messages that the ancient Hebrew people would have used. They say that abortion is a threat to the survival of modern American Christians in particular. They say that homosexuality is a threat to the family system and to population issues. And they draw on these ancient Hebrew Bible biblical texts to stoke fear, even though it has become abundantly clear from science and psychology that we are not in a population crisis. And in fact, many of the people that are seeking out abortions are doing so for their own health, well being, and ability to flourish in the world. And there's absolutely no evidence that homosexuality is a threat to the survival of any people, nor is it a threat to the family system. In fact, many LGBT couples are seeking to form their own families. But the problem is, if you can stand up outside of a courthouse with a photo of an aborted fetus, or you can demonize homosexuality as akin to pedophilia and bestiality, which has been what the religious right has been doing for the past 50 plus years, you can cause a lot of people to be very afraid. And the other side of that coin is that a vast majority of Americans do not live in big cities, do not live in proximity to people that are out and open as LGBT people. They might not know people that have ever had or needed an abortion, and they function in generally patriarchal societies. Most Christian communities in this country, even in cities, but especially in rural places, still believe in a very fundamentalist patriarchal vision of what our society should look like. Women are subservient to men. Men should be the leaders in the church and in society. And you're even seeing a revival of the most extreme forms of this theology, and people like Douglas Wilson, who is now risen up as one of the primary Christian leaders in the MAGA movement. Pete Hegseth goes to his church in Washington, D.C. And Douglas Wilson supports a hyper patriarchy where women don't even have the right to vote, and homosexuals and people who seek abortions could face the death penalty. All of this is hearkening back to ancient biblical texts that are stripped from their context and culture and being misapplied, I don't believe, out of genuine concern, but out of using them for fear tactics and knowing that they work to mobilize people. Because when you can draw on people's fear, you can get them to support just about anything. And so I believe the modern Christian nationalist movement, which I would say is a majority of American evangelical Christians today, are being motivated and deceived by fears that come from a 4,000-year-old context that have been revitalized in order to get them to submit and get them to become a movable base to preserve the power and privilege of a select white cisgender heterosexual Christian patriarchy.
Great. Have you seen anything in your many travels and work that has circumvented that dynamic in terms of, I'm just asking about terms of, have you seen anything that has helped change in your own encounters with others to bring things? I just, if you know what I mean. So
Yeah.
it's hard to say, but yeah, have you seen anything that sort of made a difference in that encounter? Because it seems to me we have different visions of people have different visions of Jesus, but at some point they need to encounter each other and figure talk. So can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time over the past decade of my public ministry debating conservatives, whether that's on stages at religious events or on the Daily Wire. And my initial motivation was I thought that we could present good arguments based on science and psychology and biblical scholarship and change people's hearts and minds. But what I've learned in the past decade is that debate doesn't actually change people's minds. What people need is experience with the other. What people need is to have empathic understanding cultivated in their hearts. And it's no wonder that the Christian nationalist movement today is so against empathy, because they know that if people can encounter diversity, if people can experience their neighbor who has a different worldview or life experience, that will begin to change their hearts and minds. And this past year, I've had the honor of visiting over 30 different cities and states all across the United States, from Alabama to Mississippi to New Orleans. And in every one of these places, the thing that has given me hope is that progressive inclusive faith communities are becoming a meeting point for even people that might not identify as religious or Christian, but simply want to meet their neighbor and know their neighbor. I remember speaking in Birmingham, Alabama about 3 months ago and looking out at what was a traditionally white mainline Protestant community. But in the community that evening were gathered people of every races and cultures, sexualities, and gender identities. And that kind of encounter, having proximity to people who have a different life experience and opening up spaces where you get to know them instead of their caricature that's portrayed in the media or by right wing preachers, is the key to beginning to chip away at people's hearts and minds and open them up to a more expansive, inclusive, and democratic way of viewing our country and our faith. And so I think the thing that we need to focus on more and more in this era is giving the voiceless back their voice, uplifting the stories and the voices of those who are on the margins, not in our big cities where people are living in proximity to diversity, but in the places where people might not know a queer person, or might not know someone who has had an abortion, or might not know somebody who has a different political or religious persuasion. They need to hear their stories, be that in media or on social media, or places in their community need to be cultivated where diverse people can feel safe to show up and get to know one another. Because it's easy to demonize one another from a distance, but it's really hard when you're standing face to face with another incarnate human who has a different life experience to throw theological or political talking points at them. And I really believe that the key to healing our nation's divide and to countering this far right extremist nationalist version of Christianity is incarnation, which is one of the most fundamental doctrines of Christianity. We believe Jesus is God become a human being so that God could dwell with us and show us what it is like to live as a human in step with God's Spirit. And so we need to work to get more people to see the incarnate reality of different ways of living and seeing and being in the world. And I think that can actually begin to turn the tide on the demonization that has happened and quench the fears that have been stoked by politicians and far right religious leaders.
Great. I love that idea of incarnate. Can you give me any anecdote or story in your past while where that incarnational transformation has you've seen it happen in your own is there anything like that? Do you have anything you could talk to?
Yeah, I mean, in my own story, as a young evangelical who ended up coming out as openly gay, I experienced a ton of backlash, a ton of fear mongering, letters and emails from pastors and mentors who thought I walked away from the truth, thought that I was becoming an agent of Satan in the world. But one of the most transformative experiences in my life is my childhood pastor, who is an evangelical megachurch pastor, but who always believed in the power of bridge building. And I actually attribute my desire to reach across divides to what I learned in that church growing up. And when I came out as openly gay, everyone else in my world from the evangelical world I came from condemned me. But this pastor reached out to me and said, "You're always going to be my spiritual son. I want to know what you're going through. What is this like? What has led you to this moment?" And over the past 15 years, we have journeyed with each other. We have shared uh, our stories with each other and our struggles with each other. It's never been reduced to debates and talking points because we know we don't agree on interpretation of the Bible. But to watch my pastor from my childhood live with me and in my story and continue to care about wanting to know what it's like for me, his heart and his mind and the way he talks about the issue of LGBT inclusion has dramatically changed. I mean, literally over the past 10 years, anytime he was going to preach about LGBT issues, he's reached out to me and said, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And again, he's not completely, fully LGBT affirming, but because of his willingness to listen to my story, to care about what LGBT people in his congregation might feel, I've watched his heart changed, and I've watched the way he and the church address this issue has dramatically softened and I think is moving towards an affirming and inclusive space. And over the past decade, I've gotten the chance to meet with so many pastors and Christian leaders from very conservative, some of the most far right environments who have just realized that they didn't know a queer person. And it's been an honor to get to share my story and to watch how their posture has changed. And even some of those churches have changed their stances. I mean, in the past decade, there has been probably 50 plus former evangelical megachurches that have come out for LGBT inclusion. Those stories aren't getting covered very much anymore. And the reason that that has happened is because those pastors and leaders realized that they needed to know the people that they were preaching against. And when they finally got a chance to hear our stories and see that we are people of faith, that we are not the caricatures that they had been preaching about, they knew that they could no longer stand on their conservative anti-LGBT theology. And the same goes with abortion. Obviously, I don't have a lot of experience with that in my own life, but I have seen pastors sit down with women who have finally shared their struggle in such a vulnerable way of why they decided to have an abortion. And when you get to hear the story and recognize that this isn't some lackadaisical decision that people are making, but is something that comes with deep contemplation, often deep anguish, that changes people's perspectives and that softens this really rigid and often harsh perspective that so many far right Christians are embracing in the way they engage with these issues and many others.
Great, very powerful. All right, so I'm going to keep it simple. What's the scandal of Jesus?
The scandal of Jesus is that the same socio spiritual revolution that he tried to begin 2,000 years ago and indeed sparked among minorities and the least of these has continued for 2,000 years, except it's been lost by the institutional church and the structures that have aligned themselves with the empire and the government. But there's always been a faithful remnant of those who have followed the social and spiritual vision that Jesus cast of the kingdom of God, which is simply the world as God intended it to be, where every person can stand arm in arm as equal, and where a more just and equal reality is expanded for all people. And this has been the longing of the Jewish people and Christian people since the origin of our faith. The entire narrative of Scripture is about oppressed people longing for liberation, and Jesus came to embody what liberation looks like. And it doesn't look like aligning with religious rules or doctrines, because Jesus constantly transgressed those. It doesn't look like aligning yourself with the political establishment to gain power and privilege, because Jesus resisted the political establishment and became an enemy of the state, which led to his crucifixion. Jesus's way is about bringing people around a table, hearing their story, empowering them with not just words, but resources and actions to go and create a more beautiful way of living and a more equal and just world for all. And if Christians, by and large, could get back to that historical message of Jesus, that scandal of Jesus, I really do think our country can be saved. And indeed, the world can be brought back from the brink of this authoritarian moment and a moment where injustice is on the rise, from the climate crisis to immigration to nationalist movements around the world. Jesus is the antidote to this scary moment that we find ourselves in. But we have to be willing to take the risk to get back to the scandal of Jesus and to follow the radical path that requires all of us to sacrifice our power and privilege for the good of our neighbors.
Great. Anything else you'd like to add, or that's all I have?
I think that was great. Thank you. Good questions.
No, thank you. No, my pleasure. Let me stop right now. But the